Now we'll hear from Avik Roy. Always interesting. Avik is the co-founder and president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that conducts original research on the impact of public policies on Americans with incomes or wealth below the U.S. median. So it's a very topical issue that you're addressing in your new foundation. You know, you will know him. He is a leading conservative change agent. He has advised 3 Republican presidential candidates and influences and forms the policy debate in his role as opinion editor at Forbes. He also has experience in medicine and finance as a former medical student and jobs early in his career at Bain Capital and J.P. Morgan. We're also honored to have Avik as a member of NIHCM's advisory board, and he's a senior advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center. He's a fierce advocate for the free market and a very effective advocate for the free market and patient-centered reforms to lower the cost of health services and prescription drugs. And we're just delighted to have him here today. Thank you, Avik.
Thanks, Nancy. It's great to be with you all and to share the stage with what I thought were some really interesting presentations from some very impressive people. As Nancy mentioned, our new think tank, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, is focused on trying to find ways to achieve the goals and the principles of both progressives and conservatives, to say, let's find solutions, let's find reform ideas that can move the needle for the people who have the least economic opportunity in America today. I think all of you understand that prescription drug prices is one area where affordability and healthcare are particularly impactful to low-income communities, because we all go to the pharmacy and pay those co-pays and when we pick up our prescriptions. So it's an area where, of course, it's not alone in terms of being a place where healthcare is expensive, as we've heard today, but it's an area where, in particular, patients are exposed to those costs. We published in May a white paper called The Competition Prescription. And the point of this paper is to try to break through the logjam we've had in prescription drug pricing. As you all know, the dynamic we've had for the last several decades has been, well, on the Democratic side, there's been a lot of concern about high prescription drug prices, advocacy of price controls and variations of price controls to try to regulate the problem. And on the conservative side or the Republican side, the view has been, well, we don't like price controls, so we're basically going to change the subject. And I think the argument here is to say, actually, the situation we have today where we have such high prices for prescription drugs, it's not the result of a free market. It's the result of specific policy decisions that Congress and the FDA have made that have allowed prices or incentivized prices to go up the way we have. And the solution to that problem is actually more competition. Competition has been the biggest driver of reducing pharmaceutical prices in the United States. So we have successes and failures, and the goal here is to hopefully learn from the successes to address the failures. So you all know this story, the story of the fact that Americans pay a lot more for prescription drugs than everybody else, right? So per capita prescription drug spending in the United States is basically double the rest of the wealthy countries in the world, at $1,327 per person in, I believe, 2014 is what this data comes from. So that's a lot, right? What you might not know is that, it's particularly thematic in this context of the value and volume debate, right? We're actually the best country in the world at putting people on cheap, low-cost, unbranded generic drugs that cost less to manufacture than a bottle of water. So, we talk about the high prices in America, but those high prices are driven in particular by the fraction that's not that 82%, it's the 18%, right? It's the 18% of drugs that aren't generics, that are branded drugs, and particularly the subset of those that are like the patented branded drugs. That's where the high prices are. The vast majority of prescriptions in the United States are for cheap, unbranded generic drugs. There we're doing very well, thanks to probably one of the most far-sighted laws this institution has ever passed, the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, which did a lot to stimulate the growth in prescribing generic drugs. And so compared to the European median of 21%, we're actually 4 times better in terms of making sure that where there's a cheap generic alternative available, people have access to that and they're using it, and the clinical effectiveness of those generics is as good as the old patented competitor. So we're doing a great job, actually, at engineering and encouraging competition when a lot of drugs go off patent. The problem is that for the branded drugs, the prices are going up. So you'll hear people say, well, growth in pharmaceutical spending is growing by X%. What often you don't see in those charts or those slides or those tables is that actually if you just look at branded drugs, the inflation is even higher, right? So in 2012, we were spending $228 billion on branded drugs. In 2016, spending was up 50%, 50% on branded drugs. Spending on generic drugs, and this is nominal data, this is not inflation data, I'm sorry, it's a little dark, you can't really see, but in 2012, unbranded generics were spending $52 billion. In 2016, we were spending $50 billion. So there was actually a real decline, a nominal decline, in the dollar value of our spending on generic drugs, even though the prescription share of generic drugs is going up. Right? So generic prices are actually going down. That's the untold story about drug spending in America, is that where cheap generic drugs are available, costs are actually declining. But for those branded, patented drugs, costs are skyrocketing. One thing you hear the pharmaceutical industry point out, the biotech industry, is that, well, you can't just go by those prices you see in the newspaper, the list prices. The list prices aren't actually what we receive in revenue. You have to account for all the discounts that come out of that list price before it actually gets to the consumer. And they do have a point, but I think it's also overstated to say that the net price that the pharmaceutical industry reports is actually the true price that's paid by consumer. That's not true either. So, and I try to walk through it here. There's the list price. That's the price that almost nobody pays, but it's the sticker price, you could say. Then there are wholesalers or distributors. The three best known are AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and McKesson. They actually buy these drugs in bulk from the pharmaceutical manufacturer and then sell them to pharmacies. And so they take a discount for buying in bulk. And Quintiles IMS has calculated that for branded drugs, that's about, on average, is about 16%. So you discount the sticker price by about 16% to get what IMS calls the invoice price. Then, to get the net price, you subtract out a few other things. So, for example, what pharmacy benefit managers do, they get rebates from the pharmaceutical industry to give more favorable position on a formulary to certain drugs over other drugs. Sometimes, for example, if you have a lot of cholesterol-lowering drugs, some are generic and some are branded, so the branded players have to basically give rebates to the PBMs, which are contracted with insurers, to basically incentivize those PBMs to stimulate more utilization of those branded drugs when the generic drugs would otherwise take over. Right? So yes, that's money that's coming out of the pharmaceutical industry to get their drugs to consumers, but it's actually a mixed bag in terms of what's happening with consumers, right? In some cases, consumers are using a costlier drug, which drives up health insurance premiums. So the cost to the consumer actually goes up. Another example is copay assistance. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies will say, hey, yes, we know our drug costs several $100,000 per patient per year, but for those low-income patients that can't afford that, we'll pay their copay and their deductibles so they don't have any out-of-pocket costs. It's a win-win, right? Because they get to say that they're being very charitable to low-income populations, and they get a lot more utilization of their drug. But a higher utilization of a high-cost drug means what? Spending goes up and premiums go up, right? So the end result for the consumer is not the net price. The net price is the end result maybe to the pharma company, but the price for the consumer is actually higher than the net price because they're paying for these higher premiums as a result of higher utilization of expensive drugs. Now, I try to illustrate that in this next chart. So if we look at the other wealthy countries in the blue there, that's the average pharma spend per capita for them, and then we say, okay, what is it in the United States and what are the different components? So the $8.99 there is the net price. This, if you add all this up, it's like $1,600. That's like the list price, the sticker price. The real impact to consumers is basically this piece plus this piece. So it's about $11.50. So, yes, we should factor in the fact that the price that consumers pay is lower than the sticker price. That should be part of your thinking about high drug prices. But even if you take that into account, we're talking about prices that are more than double the rest of the wealthy economies in the world. So it's still a huge policy problem. So I alluded to in the beginning, why are we in this situation, right? A lot of people say, well, it's the free market's fault. The free market has allowed these high prices to emerge, and if we just had more price controls, we wouldn't have high prices. Well, I'm not dismissing the fact that if you regulated prices, you could, in theory, have lower prices than we have. That's true. But it's also true that we don't have a free market for drugs, let alone anything else in healthcare. And that's also a big driver, in fact, the primary driver of why drug prices are so high in the United States. So here I've just got a bunch of bullets on many of the ways in which we, through, again, congressional policy and FDA policy, have made it easier for drug companies to charge higher prices because they're insulated from competitive pressures. So the most important is that not only do we not pay for drugs directly for the most part if we have insurance, but we don't actually shop for the insurance ourselves. So we have third-party payment of drugs, and then we have third-party payment for the insurance that pays for the drugs with a third party. So it's really ninth-party payment for drugs and everything else in healthcare, and no wonder that patients are divorced from the clinical value and the cost of the drugs that they're using, right? They say, hey, I have insurance, my plan should cover this drug. But they don't always have a real sense of how much that drug costs the system because they're so indirectly exposed to those prices. There's also the fact that there are legal monopolies, constitutionally sanctioned monopolies, right? Because if you have a patent, that patent lasts for 20 years, and on average, about 10 of those years might actually still be active when the drug gets through the FDA approval process. And we don't want to get rid of that, right? We want to reward innovation. We want people to develop innovation drugs and be able to capture some reward for that. But that's not a market, right? When you have a monopoly, it's not exactly a market. There's also the fact that federal health care programs like Medicare, like Obamacare and Medicaid and VA, in different ways, all basically mandate that drugs be covered. So the way it works in Medicare, basically every drug that's approved by the FDA has to be covered by Medicare. So guess what? That gives companies, pharmaceutical and biotech companies, an incentive to charge high prices knowing that their drugs have to be paid for by the taxpayer, regardless of what that price actually is. So this is particularly a problem in oncology, right? Because in cancer, who gets cancer? It's mostly old people who get cancer. Medicare is the health insurance for old people. So that's why oncology drugs in particular have high prices. In those areas of medicine that primarily affect people below in the workforce, pretty elderly individuals, there's a lot more leverage that insurance companies can use to fight that off and say, hey, we're going to not reimburse for this, or we're going to pitch you against a generic drug, or what have you. But in particularly diseases that affect the elderly, that's where the leverage has been the lowest because of this situation where Medicare is effectively required to pay for everything. And it's true in Obamacare, too. In Obamacare, this is more of a CMS regulation, but CMS has basically issued a regulation in the last administration that for every therapeutic class, there has to be one branded drug reimbursed by a plan that's participating in the Obamacare exchanges. What does that mean? That means that those companies have leverage to charge higher prices. There's also the fact that there isn't a level playing field for most situations where insurers and drug companies are fighting against each other, right? So the drug company, if it's a branded drug, has monopoly, but the insurers are competing with one another. They're fragmented. So they're fragmented, there's a monopoly on the other side, and the end result is that drug company has more leverage to say, hey, if you're not going to reimburse for this drug, but your other competitors are, then you're the bad guy. You're the one who's not paying for this life-saving drug. And the patients, because they're insulated from all these price signals, complain to the insurance company, not to the drug company, for charging the high price in the first place. There's also the fact that the cost of R&D has gone up considerably over the last several decades. That, of course, means that venture capitalists, pharma companies, biotech companies try to recoup their costs through higher prices. Now, it's very important to say, you hear a lot of people say, well, we have to charge higher prices because of the cost of innovation. There's basically no correlation, and the paper that this study is based on, we've actually gone through a lot of this data. there is almost no correlation between the cost of developing a specific drug and the price that the manufacturer of that drug actually charges. That's more driven by market power. If you've got a monopoly situation where you know insurers got to pay for the drug, you're going to charge a high price. If you're developing the 10th cholesterol-lowering drug, you don't have a lot of leverage and you might have to charge a lower price. Market power, not the cost of innovation, is driving a lot of prices. A great example, this is the ultra-rare disease area. So you might have a drug for a disease where the disease only affects about 4,000 people in the US, and you're charging $300,000 or $500,000 per patient per year for that drug. The cost of developing that drug is actually quite low, because the cost of R&D is basically directly correlated to the size of the clinical trials you have to do. If you're doing a 40-patient clinical trial, because there are only 4,000 patients with that disease in the country, your costs of R&D are low. If you have to do a trial in 20,000 patients because it's a diabetes drug where tens of millions of people have it, then the costs are going to be in the billions of dollars for developing that drug. But diabetes drugs can't charge high prices because there's 20 other diabetes drugs out there. So it's really market power, not the cost of innovation, that drive pricing. So whenever you hear somebody say, well, we have to charge this high price because of the cost of innovation, roll your eyes. The FDA, and I'm going to highlight this in the next slide, the FDA has actually in certain ways created artificial monopolies for drugs that are off patent. The famous examples that, like the Martin Shkreli drug that was in the news, right? That was actually a really old drug that had been off patent for a while, but because of an artificial monopoly that the FDA helped create, that drug was no longer a monopoly and Shkreli could raise the price. There are a number of different ways in which the FDA regulations have created monopolies where in theory the drug is off patent and there should be more competition. Biosimilars are a very important emerging area for more competition. So basically, as many of you know, but maybe not everyone, there's a difference in FDA regulation between small molecules that are basically pills that you could synthesize in a high school chemistry lab, like aspirin, like cholesterol-lowering drugs like Lipitor, versus monoclonal antibodies and other big proteins which come out of the DNA revolution of the last several decades. Those larger proteins have to be manufactured much more carefully in much more specialized ways, and they're not so easy to replicate. And as a result, the FDA has been much tougher on, and it had created much higher regulatory barriers for generic competition for those biologic drugs, which has meant that the original manufacturers of the original innovative drugs have had much longer runways in terms of having their monopolies than they would have had otherwise. And we'll get into that a little bit more later as well. There's also just a kind of intellectual and cultural bias at the FDA and elsewhere against so-called Me Too drugs. There's culture that says, well, we have to have innovative drugs, not Me Too drugs. Me Too drugs are bad. Well, that's not true. If you have Me Too drugs that are, say, similar in profile and molecular structure and clinical profile to an existing drug, guess what that means? If you have 2 or 3 or 4 drugs competing for that group of patients, prices go down. Right? So we've had this bias against Me Too drugs because intellectually we say, well, that's not as innovative. But economically, from a public health standpoint, it's actually very important to encourage the development of Me Too drugs because Me Too drugs mean lower prices for every American. So let's focus on these 3 areas in particular. Before we get to that, let me talk about one of these ideas, which is orphan drugs. So this is an example of where Congress has created artificial monopolies. So in 1984, Congress passed this law called the Orphan Drug Act, basically in order to stimulate R&D for diseases with less than 200,000 patients in the United States. The idea being that because those markets were relatively small, because they had fewer patients, drug companies and biotech companies didn't have an incentive to develop drugs in that area. So basically what the law did is it said, okay, even if the molecule you're testing in your clinical trials has no patentability, it's an old drug, it's been around for 100 years, if you develop it for a disease that's relatively rare, we'll give you 7 years of monopoly exclusivity, as if you had a patent. What's happened effectively because of that law, which has a lot of good intent and good policy results behind it, is Congress kind of overshot. Actually, I shouldn't say kind of, it really overshot. So the end result is what companies can do now is, okay, we can develop a drug and study it in this very small patient population that has a particular mutation for lung cancer and have 7 years of exclusivity. And once that exclusivity is running out, we can study in a different mutation, in a different cancer, and then get another 7 years of exclusivity, and then another 7 years of exclusivity for a drug that has no patents because it's been around for several decades. So some manufacturers have taken advantage of that legal opportunity, completely legal opportunity, to have long monopolies for drugs, far contrary, I think, to the intent of the designers of that law. So it's gotten to a point now where orphan drugs are taking over our pharmaceutical spend. As I show in this slide, in 2015, so-called rare diseases are actually a quarter of all pharmaceutical spending in the United States. By 2020, it's going to be a third, $176 billion for diseases that affect, or for drugs that affect, and that try to treat very rare diseases. And I'm not saying that those aren't important, right? If you have one of those rare diseases, you really care. But diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure matter too. Alzheimer's, right? The diseases that affect tens of millions of Americans. Basically, we've created an incentive for drug companies to move away from studying those big disease populations because there's so much more of an economic incentive to study rare diseases. So again, let's focus on some of these areas where public policy has created artificial monopolies and what we can do to change it. So we talked about the stacked 7-year monopolies for orphan drugs. There's also something the FDA started about 10 years ago called the Unapproved Drugs Initiative, where there are a bunch of drugs that have been on the market for a long time before the FDA actually existed. And because those drugs predated the FDA, they've been on the market legally for many, many years. So the FDA a few years back said, we don't like that. We're going to try to get those unapproved drugs off the market. Here's how we're going to do it. We're going to encourage manufacturers to do clinical trials for those drugs, and the first one to do kind of a traditional set of clinical trials, we're going to give them a monopoly for a period of time in order to reward them for the cost of doing those clinical trials. Well, the end result has been a lot of this Martin Shkreli type action where, okay, a company does those clinical trials, they get a monopoly, and then they jack up the price by 6,000%. Right? So again, the FDA had certain good intentions. Hey, we want to make sure that these drugs that have been around for hundreds of years have a certain kind of regulatory and safety profile that we can certify. But they didn't really think ahead and say, okay, we're creating this incentive for exploitative pricing. So that's one area where the FDA has kind of maybe, again, not thought ahead about costs. Another area that FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb has written a lot about in his pre-FDA life when he was a colleague of mine at Forbes and has talked about as well in his current role is the issue of generic drugs where there's a specialized delivery technology associated with it. So EpiPen is an example. Epinephrine, the drug that is in EpiPen, has been around for over 100 years. But the injector that the company Mylan uses to administer epinephrine, that has a patent around it. And so what stymied competition in this area is that if you want to be a generic manufacturer of an EpiPen, you have to prove to the FDA that the exact physical kinetics of the way your epinephrine enters the body are the same as Mylan's. But you can't do that without running into Mylan's intellectual property around their proprietary injector. So the FDA has not had the toolbox to say, you know what? It actually doesn't matter if it's exactly the same as EpiPen. We just have to make sure that we have the same clinical effect so that the patient who needs that epinephrine injection actually can get treated, right? And so there are things that the FDA can do on its own to try to address that. But Commissioner Gottlieb, again, in his previous work, has long argued that really if Congress helped create, as an amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a new pathway for those kinds of medicines, so that if there was some delivery technology around it, we could create a new pathway to make sure the FDA could show that they were clinically equivalent, these two different injectors, even if they weren't physically equivalent, that would do a lot to stimulate competition in this area. Another area that you may have heard of is REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. So the famous example is thalidomide. Thalidomide was actually one of the reasons why the FDA was created in the first place. It was a drug that was marketed in, I believe, the 50s for leprosy. It turned out that it was causing birth defects in pregnant women. And so it was clear that we have to have an agency that's keeping an eye on for this. So the drug, thalidomide, has been around for a very long time. Celgene, a company based in New Jersey, discovered that actually there was a lot of utility for thalidomide in multiple myeloma, a very serious disease. And so they did clinical trials to get thalidomide approved for that. And then they had a little bit of exclusivity because they did those trials. But the real monopoly opportunity for Celgene was the FDA said, well, because of this risk of birth defects, we have to have a risk management strategy to make sure this drug doesn't get into pregnant women. Celgene developed that pathway. They patented it, and so no one could create a generic version of thalidomide because there was a patent around the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. And the FDA went through a spate of actually creating more and more of these REMS protocols that people could patent and therefore blocking competition. So there's, again, a way to standardize maybe REMS protocols so they don't have intellectual property around them, which will allow more generic competition. And then this last bucket I want to focus on is the biosimilars piece. So biosimilars have been accelerated in the marketplace as a result of a kind of a provision within the ACA called the Biologics Price and Competition Innovation Act of 2009, or BPCI. That bill tried to create some measures that are like Hatch-Waxman so that biosimilars can get to the market in a more standardized pathway. But the problem is that it's not exactly the same. So as I note here, if you have an off-patent drug that's a small molecule, like an aspirin, and you do clinical trials, you can get 5 years of exclusivity, and then there's generic competition. For reasons that basically have nothing to do with economics or policy, but have everything to do with politics and lobbying, that's 12 years for biologics. There's no reason why it should be 12 years for biologics and 5 years for small molecules. It should be basically the same. Because if you don't have a patent, there should be the opportunity to actually develop competitive drugs in that area. If you have a patent, fine. Have all the life of that patent and have that legal constitutional monopoly for an innovative medication. But if it's not innovative, there should be a harmonization between a small molecule and a large molecule. And another key area, one of the reasons why that chart I showed in the beginning about the 82% uptake of generic drugs, it's because at the pharmacy level, Walgreens or Duane Reade or CVS can substitute. If your doctor prescribes Lipitor, a cholesterol-lowering drug which is now off patent, the pharmacist can substitute generic atorvastatin without asking your permission. So here's your bottle of atorvastatin without asking the doctor's permission. That's one of the key elements of Hatch-Waxman that's led to higher uptake in this country compared to other countries of generic drugs. The BPCI is not as strong on that point, and so a lot of states, at the behest of local companies, have created barriers where you have to ask the doctor's permission or the patient's permission or both, or go through a bunch of other hoops before you can get that biosimilar prescription. And so in that way, competition has been inhibited at the state and local level for biosimilar drugs. So we've alluded to a number of the ideas that we talk about in this paper for how you can actually increase competition in prescription drugs and therefore lower prices. Some of the things I haven't highlighted yet that I would encourage you to think about is I mentioned that we have this bias towards Me Too drugs. Well, one way in which that bias is manifest in FDA policy is FDA has this thing called fast track designation, where if you're a drug for an unmet medical need that's truly innovative, the FDA will give you certain more accelerated review times and sort of an easier process to get through the FDA. Well, we could easily have something similar for areas where there isn't enough competition. We could have a fast track for areas where there's a monopoly or one or two drugs for a particular disease area, but we really need more because of that public health problem that comes from monopolies and lack of affordability. Another thing we could think about is to emulate the success of Medicare Part D in leveraging generic drugs into Medicare Part A and Part B. Right now we have basically 3 different parts of Medicare that pay for prescription drugs. Part A is for the hospital-based drugs. Part B is for drugs that are administered in a physician office, usually IV infusions. And then the retail pharmacy drugs in Part D. We could do a lot of different things to integrate Medicare coverage of prescription drugs to allow the cost savings we've seen in Medicare Part D to be leveraged throughout those other Medicare sections or Medicare parts. Another area we should think about is maybe creating a safe harbor for insurers to jointly negotiate with a drug company in a particular state for the prices of that prescription drug. So instead of having this unlevel playing field where the drug company has a monopoly and the insurers are fragmented, maybe the insurers could actually jointly negotiate for that drug price and therefore not fear that if one insurer doesn't cover it and they get beaten over the head versus the other ones, they might have a stronger ability to negotiate and get those prices down. A nice advantage of that approach is it would diminish the incentive for insurer consolidation, which is a big problem that we've been dealing with for the last couple of years. At the end of the day, the best solution for making sure that we have a more competitive system with drugs is to make sure that every American, or as many Americans as possible, are choosing the health insurance plan that covers them. That's something the ACA accelerated in a certain way. It's something that free market conservatives want to accelerate. The more people that are choosing their own insurance, and we get away from this ninth-party system of health care, that's going to do the most to stimulate and incentivize lower-cost prescription drugs and the utilization of the low-cost options that we have available today. So with that, you have a copy of this paper, the full paper in the folders if you picked one up outside, if you're attending. If you're watching this online or on C-SPAN, you can download the paper from our website. That's freop.org, freopp.org, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks for your time.
Well, Avik, that was terrific. You covered a lot of ground there, and I think all of us learned some new things.